Welcome back. Host Steve Davies is back with us, as is guest Press Wheeler, to talk about the F-35A, the Air Force version of the F-35, and Press's first time with the program. I'm admittedly pretty biased, but I think what you're about to hear is an amazing interview about the F-35. The F-35 program has been around longer than the active lifespan of some other aircraft, and it's still just in the early days of its service. Unsurprisingly, there are very strong opinions, pro and con, about the F-35 program. I believe Steve and Press give us an in-depth and unbiased look at the F-35, what it can and can't do, and where it fits into the Western order of battle. Without further ado, here is Steve Davies with Episode 2 of the F-35. This is authentic.
Press, welcome back to this series on the F-35. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
So for everybody who's joining us at home, you'll remember that Press joined us for this first episode in this special series on the F-35 by Authentic Media. And in that episode, we talked about some of the requirements and some of the broader concepts that define the F-35, or the Joint Strike Fighter program as it's also known. Today, we're going to talk about the F-35A, which is the version of the aeroplane that was purchased or is being purchased by the United States Air Force and other air forces around the world too. Press, can you just give us a quick summary in terms of autobiographically about your background and how you have a connection to that airplane?
Sure. In broad strokes, my first connection, I saw a picture of it on the wall when I was at IFF, Introduction to Fighter Fundamentals, in 1998. That's the first time I ever heard of or seen what a JSF was. And that was a Lockheed Martin poster, I think. And then I didn't really see much of it again until about 2006. I was at the time a weapons officer. So that's like kind of the chief IP of the wing down at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, and started to talk to someone who came to brief us on the requirements that were being developed for the F-35. I thought I was going to go work for that individual, and I ended up, the Air Force decided to send me somewhere else while I was at that other location, which happened to be at PACAF headquarters in Hawaii. The Air Force put out a release asking for the first operational pilots for the F-35, and I put in my application for that and got selected. So I was part of the initial 10 cadre of non-test pilots that were selected to fly the jet. Turned out it got delayed a little bit. I was preparing the way for the jet, but it delayed about 18 months before it actually started flying. And by that time, I ended up going back to the F-16 after about 2 years' time there, and never ended up flying the F-35. Flew the F-16 for the rest of my career until right towards the very end. And then I came back to the F-35, and then I was the wing commander of the F-35 training wing, one of 2 training wings in the U.S. at Eglin Air Force Base in Northwest Florida. And that was the 33rd Fighter Wing. I did that for 2 years and then made a family decision to retire, and I live in Northwest Florida now.
And so you mentioned some dates, or you mentioned delays. You said your initial cadre, one of the first 10, picked up to fly that as a non-test pilot. So the A model first flew in 2006. It was supposed to be operational, or it's supposed to declare operational capability in 2013. It didn't do so until, I think, 2016. Can you talk a little bit about then what it meant to be initial cadre, and what did you do for that period of time then if the airplane wasn't available for you to fly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they went about the F-35 a little bit differently than other programs. And the reason why, as we looked at the numbers and how many folks we were going to need for the F-35, we started backing up the math. And we said the training pipeline for pilots really needs to start a lot sooner than they had originally had it drawn out. Otherwise, we're never going to get the number of pilots we need, and we're going to have empty cockpits for the once we got through. And we talked in the episode on requirements about the LRIP concept, right? So once we get to those middle LRIPs or about the 2012-13 timeframe, we had a pretty big demand for pilots to be able to make those actually operational. So what they decided to do that was a little different is they said, we're going to bring in FTU instructors before we even bring on operational test pilots. So developmental test guys were still there, but the operational tests did not really exist for the F-35. And so they decided to do FTU prior to operational tests. And that's a departure from the norm. And so when they went out to look for initial cadre, they looked for folks who had training experience. And as we'll talk to you throughout this podcast, that's really where my bread and butter is in training. It's where I did my weapons officer command. It's where I eventually did my squadron command tour. It's where I did my wing command tour. And it's really where my heart is in the training side of things. But when they brought us on, and this was in 2008 that they asked for the nominations. By 2009, they'd made the selections. I was supposed to get there sometime between 2009 and 2010. Well, I went to school at Air Command and Staff College, and the squadron commander of the initial cadre, which was the 58th Fighter Squadron, he actually called me at school and said, drop everything and come down here right now. He said, we're supposed to get the jets in 2 months. I've got 4 people here right now, and we are not ready. And I said, sir, respectfully, I got 2 months until I graduate, and I'm not doing this year of school again. I promise you, as soon as I graduate, the day I graduate, I will drive directly down to Eglin from Maxwell. So from Alabama to Florida is not a far drive. I'll be there. I'll be ready to go and help. About 5 days later, he called me back and said, it's good. Take your time. I was like, what happened? And he said, well, it looks like the aircraft is not going to be delivered for another 6 months. And so basically what happened was, and then there were more delays after that, and they totaled about 18 months. I think what happened was there were a whole lot of things that were differences in policy because we had changed the way we were doing business in terms of the test cycle, and where we were in the test cycle for developmental tests wasn't quite as far along as the perfect plan. And that, by the way, that's just par for the course. You never have a test plan that's going to go absolutely perfectly. They always get delayed. But for the personnel side of things, they had to be ready in case it went perfectly. So like most programs, it got delayed. If you look at any aircraft coming out, I challenge you to find one that doesn't have delays. But it got delayed that first 6 months. And so when we were there for that first 6 months, we didn't have any other planes to fly. And so we were basically staff officers because nobody knew how to spell F-35 at that time. So we were doing things that stabs were going, well, there's this new airplane coming. We don't know anything about it. Just call the guys down at Eglin and they'll figure it out. So we were figuring out policy things. We were figuring out tactics. And we were also talking to the pilots from the Marine Corps who were going through the exact same process for the B model. And when the program stood up, the U.S. Congress said, we're going to stand up a joint training center at Eglin Air Force Base. And we're going to have, initially it was like 140 jets or somewhere thereabouts, a lot of jets. And we're going to have Marines, we're going to have Navy, we're going to have Air Force. They're all going to be there together with this common airplane, training together. And they're going to learn from each other, and it's going to be a beautiful thing, and we're all going to learn, and we're going to raise the ocean together. Well, as it turned out, we got there, and there was no plane to fly. And so what we did, and this is actually, I really treasured this part of my career, is we would sit down with the Marines who were already there. The Navy hadn't quite gotten there. They were a couple years behind on the timeline here, but we sat with the Marines, and we talked tactics, and we talked about the F-35 and the future capabilities we're going to have. We were brainstorming on, okay, so we don't have a plane to fly yet, but we had simulators. They were pretty limited in what they could do, but we would go fly the sim, and we'd fly with the Marine bubbas, and we'd sit around in rooms and talk about tactics, and then we'd do staff work. And then after about 4 or 5 months of that, we all wanted to poke a sharp stick in our eye because we weren't flying. And so then we started saying, in order for us to safely operate a brand new jet that's pretty expensive, you may want to let us have some sort of currency. And so they started letting us go out to different bases and fly for currency. And then eventually, as the delays continued, we brought a couple of F-16s over from Luke Air Force Base, and we flew those on a daily basis just to keep some currency. So when we got the F-35, because it's a single seat fighter, we didn't want to be like, well, I haven't flown in 2 years, so let me go take out this new jet. And we weren't test pilots. And so that's how they kept our proficiency up. So those were the things we did back between 2010 and 2012. And the first delivery of the F-35 from the plant to Eglin was tail number 746. And that got delivered the 11th of July, 2011. So I had, at that time, been there a bit over a year. And then it sat at Eglin while we unlocked other policy things and tests did their thing. And then about 6 months after that, we started actually training folks. And by that time, it was time to go do something else for me.
Let me backpedal with you a little bit, or you can backpedal a little bit then, to talk about what the Air Force was expecting to do with the F-35. I don't remember if we talked about the actual mission set. We talked about in the episode on requirements, we talked about door kicking, day one scenarios, China, yes, that kind of thing. What was the Air Force wanting to do with the airplane?
Well, I think to answer that question, you really have to look at what was the F-35 or JSF community trying to do with that aircraft. And there's two perspectives to this. So the community, there are a lot of different opinions based on who you were and where you sat. So from the Air Force point of view, really looking for something to be able to provide mass in terms of like number of weapons platforms, number of aircraft, but also to have that stealth and sensor fusion capability. So for a forward-looking adversary, so that we could start to replace an aging fleet. So really, we were looking at how do we replace the F-16s that had quite a few miles on them. The F-22 had replaced the F-15C, and then the F-15E was a pretty small niche capability by U.S. size of force standards, and the F-16 was really the bulk of the force. And so the F-35 was meant to replace that and be survivable through stealth to do a whole assortment of missions. And along those lines, we had pilots from all different airframes that came to the community. So we had F-15E pilots, we had A-10 pilots, we had F-16 pilots. That was the initial cadre. And then as I moved on in my career, you started to see you had F-15C pilots that came in. And things really started to shift, I would say, where the F-35, I think the Air Force started to recognize the fact that stealth is not going to be the end-all be-all, and we needed to look at not just stealth, but what is the entire sensor suite of capabilities. And so a lot was put into the multifunctional radar that can do a lot of things other than just lock up an air-to-air target. So things that had been done before, but to put them all onto one platform to really get that multi-role, but to start to bring it back into the electronic warfare spectrum as well, because we had lost the capabilities with the F4, specialized F4s and EF-111s and those sorts of things that we had divested from. So there was a little bit of a requirements creep to go back to some of those capabilities as we started to look at the way other threats were developing and how they were developing specifically to counter our advantages. We knew we had to get back into the electronic game. And so the F-35 kind of made that move. And I would just say the multifunctional radar was a really big part of that.
It's a bit of a rabbit warren, I suppose, to go down, but we're talking about it, so we should probably just address it right now then. So in terms of those mission sets and the things that you were going to do, yes, you're going to respond to the development of threats by adversary nations and that kind of thing. But there was also this question of close air support, and there was this question of the F-35, the Air Force using the F-35A as a substitute or alternative to the A-10 and the retirement of the A-10. And you just mentioned amongst the pilots that were pulled from other airframes were A-10 guys to come in and give the F-35 community some CAS experience. Can you summarize or expound on, even if you want to, the argument for using or for not using the F-35 in a CAS environment?
You bet. There's two types of CAS. There's permissive CAS and non-permissive CAS. For permissive CAS, you're in an environment where there's not a large threat that you're going to be shot down. So there's not a whole lot of mobile surface-to-air missiles. If there are some threats, they're generally down low. They are, man pads or shoulder launch heat-seeking weapons, or very small radar-capable weapons. But for adversaries that we were going against at the time, so we're thinking about insurgents in Iraq, different groups that are not very technologically advanced in Afghanistan. The F-35 is not the right platform to do close air support in those environments, and this is where, for permissive CAS, it's probably not the best platform to use, in my opinion. And the A-10 is a much better suited platform for those specific environments. Now, that doesn't mean the F-35 can't be effective to a certain extent in those environments, but where it's lacking, there's a couple of things. One is the A-10 is basically an aircraft built around a gun, okay? The gun remains a very important weapon for a high collateral damage scenario because it's precise and it doesn't have the frag patterns and those sorts of things are much more limited. So to have a powerful gun in a situation where determining which are the good guys and which are the bad guys requires you to be up close and personal. You want to have a gun and you want to be able to go slow enough that you can see with your eyeballs to contribute to your situational awareness. Now, you can replace your eyeballs with a sensor, with an infrared sensor, and that's basically what the F-35 does. The problem with that is because of some of the concepts we talked about in the requirements podcasts, you can go back and kind of listen to those. If you start putting sensors on that are able to see at angles that are not right underneath the jet, then you have to hang them on the jet somewhere. And guess what you just did? You just increased the radar cross section. Well, that doesn't really matter if it's a permissive environment. So when we talk about CAS for the F-35, if you go to a non-permissive environment, i.e. you don't have complete air supremacy, which we've been pretty well spoiled with in the West for the conflicts, within the last 30 years. But if you happen to not have that, your A-10 is simply not survivable. It cannot survive in that environment. And that's where you start to make the case where, because you have stealth, because you have other systems on board that make you more survivable against surface-to-air threats and air-to-air threats, for that matter, in a real non-permissive environment, now you're going to need that multi-role capability that the A-10 simply does not have. So it's all a question of perspective of what do you see the next threat? And then we often in military planning talk about the most dangerous and the most likely COA. So I would sum it up to say the most dangerous course of action or the most dangerous scenario is one against a highly capable adversary against which we don't have dominance and we still need to do close air support. That's really dangerous. I would much rather be in an F-35 in that scenario. But the most likely is we don't have that big high-end conflict. We have other smaller conflicts. And then I would rather have the A-10 in that scenario. And people go back and forth with which kind of mindset they walk into. And that's why you hear the debates, like which one's better. And my answer is this, what we call the standard weapons officer answer. And it depends on all those factors that I just described.
It was interesting, and when we last spoke, you were talking about Secretary of Defense Gates' decision to cut short the acquisition of the F-22, and you talked about the requirement to balance the present with the future. Right. I suppose that the A-10 F-35 CAS argument perfectly demonstrates the challenge in doing that, doesn't it?
It sure does. And what do you do? Because, and I empathize I certainly can't sympathize because I can't put myself into his shoes, but I can empathize with Secretary Gates being in a tough position. You know, I was at the Pentagon for a couple of years, and we lined the halls, you know, as soldiers came back or as people lost loved ones, to respect them. And that's what you're seeing. And that's an emotional thing. And that's a tough thing. And so I can understand why there's this pull to concentrate on the current war if you think you got the future covered. But it's all a matter of perspective. Because again, that most dangerous course of action, the most dangerous COA, is out there and you can't ignore it. And eventually it's going to come home to roost. And so this is just Press Wheeler's opinion. My opinion is that it's come home to roost now, and we've at least seen our technological advantages diminish a bit because our adversaries saw the way we fought in Desert Storm, and then we were very much focused on the counterinsurgency campaign, while those adversaries developed a way to counter the way we fought in Desert Storm, and we did not make a corresponding. We made certainly advances in technology, but not to the extent that we didn't allow them to close that gap quite a bit. So that's basically what happened.
Can we just stay with that, the CAS topic at the moment, just briefly, and I suppose that will roll into another topic of conversation, which is the weapons that are cleared for use on the F-35. So one of the things that people say about F-35 and CAS is it's got this sort of piddly little gun with a low rate of fire, and it doesn't have a great set of weapons that it can use, and it doesn't have many of them in any case. What's the practical or what's the philosophical answer to that?
So I would start by saying, if you look at the other versions of the F-35, and I know you're going to do a podcast on the B and the C, so I'll let them address that. But I talked to the guys who were on those requirements boards on the Air Force side, and it was a minor miracle that they even got a gun into the F-35A, because everything had to be done as commonly as possible. And the Air Force just would not back off of the fact that we need a gun. So it's interesting, the perspective of, it's a piddly little gun. Well, we almost had nothing, right? If you look at what the Marines and the Navy have, it's a gun pod that's external that you have to strap on. So you cannot do close air support with a gun in a non-permissive environment without an F-35A. As few and as piddly as those rounds are, at least you got something. And then the other thing is, of course, the eventualities of you could get into a situation because of ROE or whatever the case may be, where you're in a dogfight, like we talked about in the requirements session with the F-22. Same could be true with the F-35. And so I think what happened was they used technology to say, if we can make the bullets count more by improving the aiming solution and the prediction of the bullets, time of flight, and those sorts of things, we can reduce, because really it was all about weight. As they made requirements choices for the F-35, it was all about the weight. I heard rumors, and this may or may not be true, so don't quote me on it, but I guess I'm quoting them on a podcast, but that for every, call it, like, this is hypothetical, but the rumor was for every X number of ounces of weight that somebody that was designing the aircraft could figure out how to save, then they got like a bonus or something like that. It was like that important. And that's why when you go into an F-35 cockpit and you look around, there's like nothing in there. And even that, they said before, it was all on the glass. Like you could raise and lower your landing gear on the glass only. Like you didn't even have a landing gear handle. And so now there's like this little dinky handle in there, just because the pilots were like, no, I will have a landing gear handle. That's non-negotiable. Like, I'm not going to be that dependent on glass. They're like, hey, we can save a few ounces. We get rid of that handle. So that's just a little microcosm of the decisions that were being made. So when you talk about putting a gun in, you're certainly not going to put an A10 size gun into this platform where weight is so critical. And so that's, again, kind of the playoff of the, close air support is really not what this fighter was designed for. Although it was designed to replace most every multi-role fighter, and eventually the A-10 as well. That was an additional role versus what the jet was really designed to do.
And I think that at the point at which the airplane reached IOC in 2016 or whenever it was,
2016,
the Air Force said that its primary role is SEAD and DEAD, so destruction and suppression of enemy air defenses. Then,
right.
So tell us about the weapons suite then, in terms of what you can drop. Small diameter bomb, JDAM series. What can you put on the airplane?
Yeah, so this is a story that's constantly changing. And so there's a couple of big factors, right? The first one is, do you want to be in stealth mode, or do you want to be in what we used to call beast mode? The F-35 is pretty performant at lower altitudes with a pretty heavy load of armament. And so people talk bad about, how many weapons it can carry, but that's only when it's in stealth mode. So if you're going to carry the things you're going to drop and they have to be inside the belly of the aircraft, of course you're going to be limited. And you're going to be limited in quantity, and you're going to be limited in size of weapons. So when you look at small diameter bomb, I can put 4 per side inside and still have a couple of missiles inside the weapons bay, and that gives me the ability to hit 8 different desired points of impact on a battle space. Of course, that target is not going to be, or that explosion is not going to be as large as if I put a 2,000-pound bomb in there, or a 1,000-pound bomb. So it really just depends on where you're carrying it. But every time you integrate a weapon into the jet, you have to integrate it completely. So it's not just like, okay, we'll just go strap on a new weapon. We got a brand new weapon invented, throw it on the jet. It's not nearly that simple. You have to change the operational flight plan, the operational flight program, to integrate it onto all your displays, so you can select the weapon, you can select what kind of fuse you're going to have for the weapon, etc. And then it's got to get tested. It's got to get tested internal, external, on all the different stations. That's something, a program we call Seek Eagle, that tests that out. Is how does it get carried? Like, what does it do to the wings when it's carried? Is the flutter going to break the wing off? Like, that's a big process. And then how do I even load the weapon onto the stores management system? All of those things require software development, hardware development. They require connections to the jet. And so you naturally start with the most important weapons that you're going to use. And so you have in the F-35 the ability to drop a laser guided weapon. You have the ability to drop a GPS guided weapon. You have the ability to drop a hybrid weapon, and you have the ability to drop small diameter bombs. And all of those can be carried internally or externally. You have the ability to carry air-to-air radar missiles, radar-cued missiles. You have the ability to carry air-to-air heat-seeking missiles. And those primarily are carried for the heat-seeking missiles externally. But there's some other ways that you can make it work, and that's new technology to kind of put those internally. So it's changing constantly is the answer. So the roadmap for the F-35 keeps expanding the weapons, but those 3 basic capabilities between basically GPS guided or positionally guided, I would say, however you get that position solution, whether that be through your radar mapping or through satellite constellation or something that gives you a precise location as best you can, or something that uses the IR, whereas the pilot, you are looking for heat sources and being able to match that to what you're looking for as a target, whether that be a mobile thing or something that is in relation to an IR infrared scene. You can cue a weapon that way. So those are the 2 ways you cue it. And then the hybrid that kind of takes the best, or does an algorithm to say, right now I'm going after a location, now I'm going after a heat seeker, now I'm going back after a location as the situation changes. That's the capability that you really have as of today. And then there are other capabilities that are being worked on for the future.
It's interesting. It brings to mind then the question of how some of that stuff happens. And I know that your you're limited in what you can talk about with regards to some systems. But EOTS, electro-optical targeting system, says that is, can you describe what that is? And can you say, does that have parity with the old sniper pod you would have flown with on your F-16? Does it have the same utility?
It's a great question. And I've used both. I've used both extensively. But let me start with a description of what it is for those who don't know. So the electro-optical targeting system is basically a system that does that infrared scene mapping that I just talked about in a very targeted way. Think of like looking through a soda straw. So you're using the rest of your system to cue that into a specific area. And now you're like really looking at the picture. And the picture can be displayed either way. It can either be optical, like a big, huge camera that's like using lots of lenses to zoom way in. It's like you're a Canon Rebel with 1,000 times zoom, or think of it kind of that way. Or it can go to infrared, which is kind of doing the same thing, and you can see the same picture, and you can kind of go back and forth. And that way, because the atmospheric conditions will determine how good your infrared picture will be. And so you might be able to do it with the electro-optical spectrum much more effectively. But then sometimes your light spectrum, which is really what defines electro-optical, is not favorable. And then you can go with the infrared spectrum, and you kind of go back and forth. So that's a pretty cool system that, in the fact, it goes both ways. But things like a sniper pod can do that too. Okay. The Lantern pod, which is the first pod that we really used for targeting in my career in the F-16, that was just infrared, didn't have optical at all. And then you started to get the Lightning pod and the Sniper pod, two different versions of pods that now started to bring in the electro-optical and had a way better resolution. So things that in the F-16 back in the late 90s looked like fuzzy things that I tried to like play the game where you look at a picture cross-eyed and say, I see an elephant. That's kind of what we used to do. That was our training, was like, how do you take fuzzy things and determine what they are? Well, that got way better when we got Sniper and Lightning pod. And I would say the EOTS pod, or it's not a pod, it's actually integrated into the F-35. That is on par generally in terms of the picture quality with those Lightning and Sniper pods. There's a huge operational difference between the two of them, though. The Lightning and the Sniper pods, if I'm talking back to my days in the F-16, and I think it's like this in most every platform, you put them out on what we call the chin of the aircraft. So just behind the intake on the F-16 and on one side or the other. And so it's very easy to look sideways, because that little bit of extension in terms of the geometry of where the pod hangs on the jet, because it's external, allows me a lot of good angles to see something, especially when I'm doing what we call a wheel, which is just like circle about 4 or 5 up to 10 miles away. And I'm using my targeting pod to just constantly look into an area, because I'm trying to discern very specifically. And maybe I'm trying to make a determination of a friendly from an adversary. I need time to watch and see a little bit of pattern of life, we call it, right? To see what they're doing. And that helps me make that determination. Now think about the geometry of, instead of being on the outside chins on an F-35, to keep this thing stealth, they have to put it internal, and they put the special glass on there that keeps it stealth. But geometry-wise, I can't have it out here hanging off the side. It's directly underneath my butt, pretty much, right? That's where that thing sits, underneath me. And so anytime I'm banked up, which is what you have to do to fly in a wheel around a target, I can't see, okay? So as I roll up, I can't see. I have to roll out, and now I can see again. Then I roll up, I can't see. And so if I'm attacking a target straight on, or I've just dropped weapons and I'm looking behind me, it's actually way better than having it out on the chin, like I had it in the 4th gen. But if I'm attacking something from a wheel, i.e. a permissive scenario where I can just wheel up over top, it's not so good. So again, going back to kind of that A-10 cast discussion, it's just a different, it's designed for a different threat, because stealth is all important. And because I had to worry about stealth when I made the jet, I had to put it in a place where I can't really see so well when I'm circling around a target, which is much of what we did between about 2001 and 2015, 16, 17, 18.
You talked in our original call about the concept of the aeroplane sort of fusing all the data together from the various sensors. So when you're using EOS, do you ever sort of have to turn it on? Is it on all the time, and you're using your helmet mounted display? It's projecting that information on there automatically. I mean, do you turn anything on, or is it all just on all the time, and the airplane gives you what it wants to give you?
Yeah, just to the extent of the ground operations, there's, certain procedures to go through to get all your systems up and running. But I don't have to, make it a point to go to that electrical optical pod and turn that on separately and go, and it's much better integrated into the avionics, whereas an operator, it is contributing to, in some ways, the sensor fusion. And most people think of sensor fusion really as, what ends up showing up on my tactical situational display or my TSD. And it can kind of fold into that a little bit with some of the electro-optical for some of the identification of things. It can fold into that a little bit. And the other thing that it does that's interesting is that source can be used and projected onto my helmet. And this is the thing, like when I was a wing commander at the 33rd Fighter Wing, whenever I did the G-Whiz tours, everybody, what's the one question you think that they asked me about?
The display, the helmet mount display.
Yeah, when we talked about the helmet mount display, they would always ask, is it true you can see through the cockpit? They always wanted to know that. And the answer is yes. And the way it's done is through your infrared sensors are basically projecting that synthetic background where I can look down where the floor of the jet is and my legs and the ejection seat, and I can basically look through that and I can have a synthetic display of what is right there because it's being cued by the direction I'm pointing with the helmet. The follow-up to that answer is it's absolutely worthless in my opinion. Like to me as an operator, it's gee whiz, it's cool. I can't think of a whole lot of scenarios where I'm trying to look under my feet and because it's on the display, so it's not like on a operating screen where I'm trying to make a target discernment. It's just giving me general awareness. So yeah, it contributes marginally to my situational awareness. Usually by the time I've flown over something, if I didn't have awareness on it, I messed up pretty bad to begin with. So I didn't find a whole lot of utility in that, but man, the tour groups love to talk about the fact that you could see through the cockpit and you could see through your legs and see something underneath you.
Does it have utility for things like belly checks? You don't have to, or do you just instinctively do a belly check? You would just roll the airplane, look below you, and then roll it back.
That's another interesting question. That kind of brings me to training a little bit because I grew up as a fourth gen baby, and everybody that I flew with in the initial cadre were fourth gen. They'd come up in F-16, F-15E or F-15Cs. And so I think our habit patterns and kind of the way we see the world was quite different. And when I started to train brand new pilots who had never flown anything else, I think maybe there's a little bit more utility in that feature for those who, because if you never had it before, it's kind of like when if I drive a Tesla or something with a backup camera, well, I never really bought cars with backup cameras for the longest time. So I'm still using mirrors. But anybody who's had learned to drive in the last 10 years, they're like, where the heck is my backup camera? Like they can't live without it. Or the blue line on your map, on your map app, it's the same type of thing, right? So I naturally and instinctively do not use some features that I've never had my whole career, but there's maybe more application for things like belly checks for someone who's never had to do those any other way. So I can't answer what's in the mindset, But I will tell you that the younger pilots fly different, and I would even go so far as to say in many ways better than I did because of those, you know, habit patterns from old airframes that are very difficult to break.
Well, I'm going to ask you in a bit about the B course and the TX course for the F-35, and I know obviously, as you've said several times, because of your background, that training piece is very important to you, and the current work you're doing is in the same space. So we'll talk about that. But before we get to that, can I ask you, as much as you can, to expound a little on what you were talking about in our last call about the sensor fusion and the way it displays information to you. You've just talked about the display, the screen, the glass. I think probably most people listening to this will have seen the unclassified footage of F-35 simulators at trade shows and air displays and stuff. And I don't know if all that symbology is made up or if it's real symbology and there's just some of it left out or whatever. I don't know what the deal is. But, you know, if anyone's curious to know what it looks like, go and do a YouTube search for F-35 display or whatever, and I'm sure you'll see some video from air shows and stuff where that is on display. But can you describe a little bit about what you see on the screen and how you interact with it? And I'm thinking about the tactical portions of flight. Can you pinch and zoom an air-to-air display? You know, what does it look like? How does it work? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so I would, you know, for kind of the back end of how did things end up on your display, I'll reference back to the requirements discussion we had, and that'll be a nice plug for people to go listen to that other one. But by the time I'm interacting with the tactical situational display, let me start big picture and then work my way in. Okay, so I've got two very large screens that the cockpit is kind of like, you know, developed around these screens because that's where I do most of my weapons employment. Most of everything I interact with is right there on those screens. I have those divided where I can combine them through portals. So I can have one half of that gigantic screen in front of me that can be all one thing, whether that's the IR picture, whether that's, you know, the some specific system that I want to see, or the tactical situational display. And the tactical situational display is really the God's eye view of this is what's going on in the battle space. Just like you referenced, I can now take and I can like blow up a section of that by zooming it in. I have different levels of expansion. All of that happens either through interaction with the glass directly or through my hands-on throttle and stick, or HOTAS. And man, if you see a F-35, and I think these are the same as what you'll see at trade shows, but if you see all the buttons that are on there, like the sequence of those buttons, and there's long pushes, short pushes, left pushes, right pushes, X, Y axis, Z axis. There's a lot of things, and that's really where the training comes in, is like, how do I optimize the jet? And you can get yourself lost pretty quickly doing what we call the piccolo drill. It's like your hands are on a piccolo, right? And you can get yourself into what we call a PIO, or pilot induced oscillation, where it's like, dang it, that's not the display I want to see, and I can't remember how to get back, and you just get lost in your display all of a sudden. So it's really a matter of proficiency, and one of the things that, as an old hat pilot who used to have a ICP, or integrated cockpit display, with the ability to just push buttons with my thumb, now everything is on the glass or with the hands-on throttle and stick, and I have no buttons to push. Like when I say buttons, I'm talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and those correspond to, you know, a telephone pad for letters, but I can always anchor my hand. So now I'm doing this on a display, and it's a laser field, and it's where your hand is, and when it comes off, that's when you're entering that particular entry. And so that's how I'm interacting with the display. That takes a lot of getting used to. And for me, having had something where I could just anchor my hand and use my thumb to push things, to go to this laser field thing, drove me nearly to the insane asylum, because it was just maddening because I wouldn't hit the right thing. I mean, it took a few months to really get comfortable with that. I was like, I just want to change my radio. Like, that's all I'm trying to do here. And then you're under, you know, G, or you're bouncing around because of turbulence, and your hand jumps off to the wrong button, and you just hit delete, and you have to start over. And so that's kind of like some of the this is an old guy complaining. The new kids, like the ones who have been using iPhones their entire lives, they don't have these problems. They're like very accurate. But anyways, and then you've got the display itself, and it's got two different things. So when I expand, I talk about that in two ways. One is I can expand around a entity to show the horizontal display kind of blown up a little bit. And the other thing I can do is I can go right on top of the entity and push a couple things on my piccolo drill and see an expansion of data. And what that's doing is it's telling me what is feeding the source of kind of what is on there. So it's giving me additional awareness that you can't see on a map. Like, how much confidence do I have in this piece of information? It's telling me things like that. And so there are times where the battle slows down enough that I have the chance to look, or there are times when it's so important that I need to look and I need to prioritize that and get the expanded data window to come up. And there are some times where I just need to see that part of the fight a little bit bigger. There's sometimes where I just want to see the whole fight and where I sit in relation to everything. And I'm constantly kind of zooming in and out between those three general perspectives, depending on what I'm trying to do with what weapons against what targets. And then I would say it's almost a little bit of a sideshow to go, okay, now I want to see the electro-optical picture because I'm getting to a refined targeting. So I would think of that as like the expanded data window is like for the electrons, and the EOTS windows and displays are for I want to see the picture because I need to identify it using my own awareness of that target system, versus I'm going to let the jet do that with the expanded data window and tell me, give me the confidence of what you think. And now I put all of that together in my head and I make a decision like, do I push this little button here to launch a weapon or not? And that's just one example. Or do I push this thing here to do something electronically, or do I take this lock with my radar to follow this thing? So all of those things are constantly going through your head to make decisions. And then you start to decide, okay, now I got to be a weapons guy now and go, okay, now if I decide I'm going to do a kinetic effect on this, which weapon do I want to use? And now I go through another repertoire and another piccolo drill to go, okay, I want this weapon, but I don't want that fuse. I want this fuse. And I got lots of flexibility, but it's a lot of training to both make that decision. And we train guys to do this in a way that you are making that decision on your own. Nobody's going to be like, yeah, I agree. I think you're right on that one. You got to make it quick. You got to make it under pressure, and you got to make it alone. So unlike 4th gen, where we always fly as a two-ship within, a visual form, not always in the past, our fundamental was I got somebody flying with me who's checking my 6 and looking out for threats. In the F-35, we don't do that. We say you're out on your own. Even as a young lieutenant, you're going to have to make those decisions on your own. And you're going to have to live with them. So the training's got to be right. And the understanding of the rules of engagement have got to be fundamental. And so, it's pretty comical when you talk to a lay person about, oh, what do you do? Oh, yeah, I'm flying F-35s. Like, man, that looks so fun. You just go up there, it's like a big roller coaster ride. You're doing loops and flips, and, it's so cool. It's like, yeah, but not really. Like, what I'm really doing is I'm trying to process a whole lot of information and make, life or death decisions for myself, for my teammates, and for the people on the ground at, Mach plus. And there's, that's not always fun. It's fun, but it's not always fun.
Can I just make sure I understand that right then? So the concept of mutual support, a 2-ship or a 4-ship formation of airplanes going out hasn't really changed, but it's just the way you execute that's changed. So your 4-ship is now separated by many miles, and right. You're off taking.
Okay. Yeah. So what you can think of is, if I have the ability to aircraft by aircraft separate out a little bit, I can cover a larger battle space. So if my mission is to protect other aircraft, they are the kinetic or non-kinetic effect delivery priority, I can do a lot better job of coverage if I can split my 8 ship to cover, several miles in between us, then if I have to pair up and go, okay, you protect him and you cover this part, you protect him, you cover this part. So I basically double. And because our sensor suite has improved enough, and if we get our training right, we can do that really effectively. And in my opinion, if you've got that capability and you fly just within a visual formation like we used to, there's an opportunity cost there. You're giving up offensive and defensive capability. The trade-off, though, is you have to get the training right to be able to pull that off, because that's even harder. It was hard enough for me as a person who had, several thousand hours in a fighter type aircraft to do it. But I was doing a lot of that learning in the actual combat system as a wing commander, and I didn't really have as much time to study, which is why I will compare myself against any of the guys that were in my training wing, F-35 training wing. They're all better than me. I guarantee you, they're all better, because they had the time to really, like, that was their job 24/7. While I was dealing with COVID, right, and policy decisions, they were figuring out which button to push when, which display to call up, how do I communicate that to somebody else. And really, one of the main roles with the F-35 is you're the quarterback. So you're not just doing this for your own aircraft and your own systems that I just went through that, decision process, but you're also going to have better situational awareness than at least any other fighter size thing out there, because you've got a better sensor suite, and you're responsible for fighter integration wise, because you can only carry what's internal if you're in that configuration. You don't have enough weapons to affect all the things that you see. And so you need to be able to communicate that. And when I say communicate that, I'm not just talking about over the radio. I'm talking about, with different passage of the links and those sorts of things, or different target assignments within your 4 ship, within your 2 ship, within your 8 ship of F-35s. But then how do you get that from that closed loop kind of network now out to others who need it? So you have to use a different combat network to do that. And how do you do that without giving away things that you don't want to give away? And how do you make sure you optimize? Because your whole force has got a limited amount of weapons. Like, you are carrying these things airborne to generally go against something that is land-based. Guess what? Numerically, you're going to lose. They got a lot more stuff than you do. So you got to make the right decisions to affect that battle space. And that's all going through your head while you're flying a jet and doing your loops and flips to music, right? You're really processing all that. And even as a wingman, I'm talking like a 24-year-old kid, right? Coming out of pilot training, you're trying to teach them how to do that and how to have that mentality. And that is a different kind of pilot training than what I grew up with when I was learning to fly the F-16. It's a total different mentality.
It's another topic I want to tackle with you, but before we do that, can I ask then a little bit more about that integration with 4.5 Gen fighters? You've talked about mass a couple of times in our conversations, and you've just referenced numerical superiority by the adversary. China infamously or famously, has all these MiG-21s and stuff that they're just going to use as sort of AMRAAM sponges, and they'll send these out in front. You can shoot all your missiles off, and then the J-16s and stuff will follow up and do their thing. How do you then make sure that those 4.5 Gen guys and girls know what they're doing? How do you integrate? And obviously you're not going to give away any methods, but what what sort of general principles do you have to make sure that you don't inadvertently give away secret capabilities?
Yeah, so I would say from a macro view, we can't look at the problem set the way we looked at like a Desert Storm. You're not going to get the ability to completely blind and deafen your adversary. You need to have sanctuaries for your fighter integration tactics, your 4th gen integration tactics, where you create a temporary sanctuary that is geographically limited, and that's what you're trying to do. So that's what I mean by, so it's if you get mass in the right area, then you can still do that even against a high-end adversary. You just can't necessarily do it across an entire battle space, at least not if you're, maybe a combination of all the effects outside the F-35, but you're not going to be able to do that with just any fighters. Like, you are going to, at best, be able to create a temporary sanctuary from which the weapons employments and the non-kinetic effects employments that are the priority are enabled. And then you're going to gracefully let that temporary sanctuary degrade until everybody is clear, or you met the intent to include, like, the sometimes there's a little bit more risk in that, and you're going to be willing to take losses, but sometimes there's not. So you got to play all that out and go, okay, conceptually, this is part of the training too, is like, okay, how do we create a sanctuary geographically and in time to do what we need to do and then get out of there? And the other part of that is the entire force needs to know, because it's a dynamic battlefield, what are the things that and the priorities of what we go after, because it's not like a fixed target where it's like, okay, you hit this, you hit this, you hit this, ready, break. No, a lot of times you don't know what you're going to be facing, and especially with highly mobile surface-to-air weapons and integrated air defenses. A lot of times you're just going out with a concept and you're going, okay, we're going to try to create some sanctuaries in these general places for these general times. We're going to prioritize hitting these things, and we're either going to try to, like, blind some certain aspect of their system, or we're going to try to make it easier to create a sanctuary somewhere else next time by taking out this. But if we don't see any of that, then we're going to take out this. And so we got this prioritization list, and everybody's got a different kind of role in that. And that's where you start getting into network-centered warfare, where you go, hey, it's no longer a kill chain, right? It's a kill web. So it's very dynamic, and you've got to figure out what is the best way to optimize what we are doing. And that's where the temporary sanctuaries kind of come into place, and the training comes into place to know how do we operate together. And that's where you can't just have F-35s, you guys go over to this base and train, F-16s, you guys go over here. You've got to have opportunities to do this together, and you got to be able to share a common scenario and play that out. And it can't be night one of the war, otherwise it's not going to go well. So that's where we have to get. We have to get to that point where we can practice that, and we can have rehearsals, and those rehearsals can change as the adversary changes, and as what we know about the adversary changes. We need to have a dynamic training environment to be able to do that.
What did you have then at Eglin when you were the wing commander in that respect?
Well, we had some stuff. And generally when I got there, so I talked a little bit about OFP releases, operational flight programs. And when I got there, we were under what they called OFP 2 Bravo. And that was not certified for combat. Okay. It wasn't until 3, OFP 3 plus, 3F is the ones that we just declared for IOC. So when I got there, we were pretty limited in what the jet could do from a combat capability standpoint. And so a lot of times we were just teaching them how to fly and employ certain things in combat, but not the full spectrum. About halfway through my tour, we had gotten to the point where the vast majority of the jets were 3F, or it was actually a program called 30P03, which is just a later OFP than 2 Bravo. And then we could do some training, and we could do it in a couple different ways. One is embedded training, and that is a common shared scenario that is amongst a 4-ship of F-35s. And it uses some of our systems to talk to each other, and we could have pretend things that everybody sees. It's pretty limited in what you could do with it, but it would at least allow you to have a more robust scenario than just training against the electronic threats that were up on the range. And so we had those as well. And towards the beginning of my tour, the electronic threats up on the range were the same threats in the same places. And there were a few different ones, but they were primarily there for test. And so they were associated with infrastructure that was used for test, right? So they had to have like, power things, and they didn't really move very much. So it was like, yawner, right? I'm going out to hit the again, right? Okay. Or whatever, I'm just making up a threat, but it's in the same place it's always been. I'm pretty sure I can do this. So that was a little bit of a challenge for those who had been there for a while. Now, if you're a brand new student, you don't know the difference. So there's still some good training. And then what we would do is we would use things like commercially available imagery, and we would make up stuff, and we'd tie scenarios to it. And we'd say, okay, here's your target set. So you can use your electro-optical stuff and go after very challenging things, or you can use your ground synthetic aperture radar to map this out on the ground and be able to distinguish that this is the thing you're going after. And I can show you in the brief with the imagery and go, all right, you're going to pretend like this dump truck is a Scud, okay? I don't know where the dump trucks are going to be, so I could even make it a little bit dynamic, but we'd be playing make-believe a little bit there. Where we really fell short, though, is that, for the electronic side of things, you're really limited to whatever was on the range. And then when you started plugging in the embedded training, it just wasn't as authentic as it needed to be. And then from an air-to-air perspective, when I got there, we were only training against each other primarily. And every once in a while, we get a unit that would be nice enough to come in, like maybe it's an F-15 unit or F-16 unit, and they would come in and we'd trade blue and red air looks, and we'd get most of the blue air looks because we were a little bit more expensive. So we'd use them as a training aid, and that was really good. But we didn't have anything permanent, and so to execute our syllabus day-to-day of training new guys, a lot of times, especially as the wing commander, like, hey man, you're not so good in this jet, like you go play the red air. So I played a lot of red air as a wing commander, and every wing commander out there listening, I know that you've done the same, so admit it. But yeah, so that's what we would do. We'd go out there, and then we'd dumb down our systems and stuff, and just pretend like we were whatever threat we were supposed to replicate. And the good thing is, at least if you're in an F-35, I can do the whole spectrum. I can replicate a really hard threat, or I can replicate a pretty simple threat. It's a pretty big waste of money, though, to go replicate a simple threat with my, X million dollar F-35. So then they got this program that they called CAS, and I can't remember what that stands for, but it's not close air support. It's basically adversary aircraft. But it was what we had here at Eglin is the Mirage F1. In my time, that's all we had, and we were so glad to get them. Like, it was great, but they had no real radar. Like, they couldn't, and there were plans as I left. They were starting to kind of upgrade some things. They weren't representative of a Night One high-end threat, and they will never be. They can't do that. You can't take a 1970s built aircraft and turn it into a recently produced adversary aircraft. So that's where the shortfalls were, and that was very frustrating because we knew that the Air Force had kind of changed its tune and really wanted us to be the suppression of enemy air defenses and destruction of enemy air defenses experts. You've got to have a pretty extensive suite of electronic things to train against in order to train for that mission. And you can play the video games with embedded training a little bit. The problem, though, is I can't work as a team. I can't share that scenario with anybody outside of my foreship. And the basic operating, for an F-35 is tactics is more than 4. So I can't even do that. And so we did a lot of hand waving. And when I say that, I'm talking about hand waving and white carding. Hand waving is, well, pretend like this was what was really happening. And that's not the way we want to train for authenticity. And so we need to have systems that let you go against something that looks as much like the real thing as possible. We need systems that can trick the operator so that when the operator looks at their displays, they can't really figure out what's real and what's not. And so, when I got out of the Air Force, just kind of a side story, I started working on those sorts of things because that was the thing that really got under my crawl more than anything is As a commander, you want to give your people the tools they need to succeed. That's pretty much my job. Put people in places to let them flourish and give them the tools they need to succeed and break down any barriers that are in their way. That's how I would describe your role as a commander at any level. And sometimes the focus is more on the people. Sometimes it's more on those big things. It just kind of depends on where you sit in the spectrum of leadership. And I was very frustrated that I couldn't do that. I just didn't have anything of it. There's nothing I could do. And so that manifested itself in two ways. One is what I just talked about, like the actual things they trained against. The training systems, in my opinion, weren't good enough. And there's been a lot of progress even in the last couple of years towards making those better, but there's a long way to go. And the other thing was like, when you come down, you're like, okay, people talk about loops and flips to music, right? Then you come down, you jump in your Corvette, you drive home, and you have your pretty wife or whatever at home. Like I've heard it all, right? What they don't realize is like after you finish that mission, you got at least another 3 or 4 hours of debriefing what just happened, because we're not going to go spend X thousands of dollars to do a training mission and get no learning out of it. So the other place I was disappointed is the visualization of the battle that just happened. Although it's come a long way since like back in, the 60s when they didn't have anything and they used to just tell stories and shoot their watch and lie to each other. Like, okay, it's better than that. But really the extent of what I had was an ability to record my screens and play them back and say, okay, at this point, here's what you saw on your screen. So you probably should have done this based on that. What I lack there is the truth data. And the sensors are good, but they're only as good as the directions they're pointing and stuff like that. For true learning, you need to know where everything is at that time. That's the truth data, and that was lacking. So that's another. So not only that, but in addition to the truth data, it's like the ability to analyze that. There's a lot of computation that goes into that, and there's a lot of visualization. So there would be times where I would have to take a stick with an airplane on the end of it and try to like point it at my training audience to show them like, this is about what it should look like. I've got a stick, okay? This is about what it should look like. Technologically, we are better than that, okay? So that's something I kind of started getting involved in after my Air Force career, was how do I try to give those better systems back to the force? And so there's products out there, like one example is there's this product called SPEAR, Simplified Planning, Execution, Analysis, Reconstruction. And what it does is it shows those visualizations in the way the warfighter wants to see them. So this company did this thing where they basically went to the warfighters first and they said, to optimize your learning, how would it be best to see this? And I guarantee you, they didn't say, oh, it'd be best to show you with a stick. No, they said, I want a 3-dimensional picture that shows me the interaction of all the different sensors and the kinetic and non-kinetic effects. And I want to be able to scale it right into that, like I'm in the cockpit. I want to scale all the way out where I'm seeing it from like Mars and everything in between. That's what I want. And we didn't really have any of that when I was in the Air Force. But the good news is there's companies that are working on that sort of thing. And that's really exciting. And that's giving us the tools, because the problem too is our pilots are so taxed with, like I just talked about, like the learning of just how to operate their own system, that they don't have time to become an expert on some debrief system where you have to like push 1 million buttons and to make this thing sing. They need something that's simple, where it just automatically records things and automatically shows you what happened, and it gets to it really quickly, so that you as an instructor can sit there with a trainee and go, let's talk about why, and let's peel back the onion. We always say, peel back the onion. I keep asking why. If I ask why like 7 times, I don't know, there's some magic number. You can read it in a book, whatever it is. I think it was 7. But you keep asking why, and eventually you get to, this is the root cause. This is the thing we got to fix. You trainee have had a misconception of how to do a threat reaction, and apparently you've had it for the last 6 months because you've been here training with us for 6 months, and we just figured out that little synapse in your brain is firing the wrong direction. The only way you can do that is if you can fully visualize what happened in the battle space, and that is truth and training. So that's the kind of thing that I'm working on now. But training is, I can't even put into words how important it is. It is our asymmetric advantage as a Western, free-thinking, forward-leaning society. We have people who culturally are willing to think for themselves, and we put them into places where, because of the possible jamming and everything that's going to be happening, they're going to have to think for themselves, or the fact they just don't have time to do anything else. And so we've got this huge advantage of culturally we can do that, but you have to go through the process and you have to have the tools. And so that's kind of what I'm passionate about now. But that all came from, my last experience with the F-35. It's a great aircraft. It has an amazing sensor suite on it. But I couldn't make it work as well as I should have been able to. And the reason why is because I didn't have the time to pour into it. But the guys who are on the line and the gals who are on the line, they don't have the time to pour into it either. They're being pulled in a million different directions. They got families, they got things they're trying to do that aren't just flying. So if I can make it efficient, then that's what we need to do to keep our advantage and take that cultural advantage of the free thinking cowboy attitude that has permeated fighter pilotdom since the beginning of time and move it forward. And that's what we need to do. And that's why I'm so passionate about training.
There is an obvious question, I suppose, which is why you don't use simulators. I mean, you've got distributed mission simulators already. They've been around a long time. You could conceivably, I suppose, strap or network together a bunch of those, do all of the stuff you talked about in terms of the truth data, because the truth data comes from a database or a lookup table, whatever it is, and therefore do it in that scenario. Why do you need to fly it?
That's a great question. So the answer, this is Press's opinion, okay? And I didn't introduce myself as Press, but that's my call sign. So Press's opinion is you have to do it in the simulator. You have to do it in a simulator. It's not one or the other. But if you stop short of ever going to a live fly environment, you're going to have a tough time executing day one of the war. And I'll give you an example. When I was, I think it was 2002, I was at Hill Air Force Base flying F-16s. At that time, we didn't have any ability to link simulators together, at least not at our base. And the Air Force Research Lab went to Williams Gateway, which used to be Willie Air Force Base, where they used to do pilot training. That base got shut down. And they had simulator bays there from when it was a pilot training base. And they linked 4 F-16 cockpits together. This was new stuff, had not been done at that time. Really, the simulators were for EP, emergency procedure training at that time. I would give up like a week of BFM, which is a very fun mission. I'd give up a month of BFM to be put on the team to go down there and be a guinea pig in their research lab and do linked up training. And I did. Okay. I took down a team, and I was a captain at the time, and I was like the senior guy going there, a team of 2 captains and 2 lieutenants. We were there. We were blocking and tackling in the simulator, doing 4-ship linked operations in the name of research for a week, 2-a-days, right? It was like training camp. And by the end of it, and we didn't have any combat data links or anything like that. It was all through COM and something called IDT, which is this thing where you push a button and then you can instantaneously kind of see where everybody is for a split second. But that was it. And then it was a lot of COM and contracts and flying game plans. And by the end of this thing, this group came in and they had a data link. They were a guard unit. They had this thing called Saddle, which is a different data link. We were waiting for Link 16 to come around. And they watched us operate at the end of this thing. They're like, wait, that's 2 captains and 2 lieutenants? And they're doing this with no data link. And we were kicking ass. It was awesome. I took the exact same 4-ship, the exact same 4 people. We went and flew an ACT ride, which is a 4V, I think it was 4V8. We got destroyed. We got absolutely destroyed in the air, in the live environment. When we went back home to Utah, we went up and it was just a bad day. Like, there was some weather we were dealing with. The radios weren't working right. One guy's radar broke, and another guy, didn't sleep very well the night before and was having some effects like in the jet and just couldn't get his act together. Okay. And we got housed. And once it starts going bad, then it really goes bad. I'll let that example speak for itself. I don't think I need to draw the parallels and conclusions there. The psychosomatic of knowing that I'm in the jet and I could really die if I do this is not there when I'm in the simulator. And no matter what anybody says, it's in the back of your mind a little bit. You'll be a little bit more risky, and usually to the bold, go the victory. So I'll be more bold in the sim. I'm not going to do it if it's going to kill myself or somebody else. So I'm not going to do that in the air. Same thing in combat. Like, I might think twice before I do that risky thing. And there's this real thing called fear. There's this other real thing called G-force, right? Like, I've got 9 Gs in an F-16 available to me that are trying to black me out at any one time. I don't quite think as clearly in that environment as when I'm sitting in a box. There's differences. You have to train not just for BFM, you have to train for the high-end, highly complex, high cognitive burden mission in a jet, at least at some point. Now, you can do a lot of it in the sim. And guess what? We did that same 4-ship. We went up another day and we kicked butt. It was awesome. But if the conditions are bad or whatever, you gotta know how to work around it. And the reason why we did better that next time is because we learned how to fold in the live lessons that we hadn't learned yet from what we just blocked and tackled all week in the sim. And we got to that place. But it was the combination of the sim and the live training. And you have to have both. Anybody who says we're going to do 100% of our training in the sim, I think you are taking a huge risk, and it's not going to end well. That's again just my opinion, and I think it's a very dangerous logic line. We've got to do both, and we can do both. We just have to decide that we're willing to invest to do both.
You talked a couple of times about BFM, and there was going back a couple of years a fairly infamous article online about, I think it was a Danish test pilot who talked about flying BFM against the F-16. He got beaten in the F-35, whatever. The question I wanted to ask you, Press, was whether or not you sort of have the same view of BFM in the F-35 community as maybe they did sort of 20 years ago, which was if you get to that point, you've messed up, so you're not going to spend too much time training to it because you're going to kill them at long range, and if not, you're going to run away or they won't see you or whatever. Do you BFM in the F-35? How seriously do you take that as a skill set?
I take it seriously, but I don't take it seriously for the dogfighting. Notice I don't call those dogfighting missions. I call them BFM. BFM stands for Basic Fluid Maneuvering. So what it is it's basically like you're doing a drill to learn how your aircraft flies, and you are taxing that aircraft heavily. Okay. The end game is, if you ever actually end up in that situation, maybe you'll have a fighting chance. If you end up in a BFM situation in an F-35, though, you better do it quick, because the fat kid is not going to perform over time. Okay. You better make it happen fast. So BFM is a different context. In a Viper, man, I want that fight to go on as long as possible because I'm skinny, I'm light, I've got a pretty good thrust ratio. If I am in a fat kid, man, I need to point, threaten, shoot, and be done. So that's really, if I was just dogfighting training, I wouldn't do BFM. I would just go for like real quick, like pop and kill, point, kill, point, kill. But I teach BFM in much the same way as I did in the 4th gen. And the reason why is because I'm teaching someone how to maneuver in relation to another object that's in motion or, another aircraft. And that has a lot of benefits that have nothing to do with dogfighting. And that's why we do it.
We're heading towards the end of our time here, Press. But can I ask you, we kind of done this conversation in an interesting order, because maybe one of the first questions I could have asked you, but I didn't, was what is it like to fly? How does the aeroplane fly? How does it handle? How does it talk to you? I think it's a single engine aeroplane. I think the official figure or the unclassified figure is 41,000 pounds of thrust or something like that coming out the back end. That sounds like an awful lot of power. I think about something like an F-16, PW229 is 29,000 pounds of thrust. So, another 25% on top of that. What's it like to fly? Is it easy? Is it challenging? Does it have vices? Tell us.
Yep. So there is no D model, if you will. There's no back seater in an F-35. So the first time you strap on the jet, you're on your own, Lieutenant. Good luck. Don't break it, right? Now, of course, there's another aircraft flying next to you, watching your every move, and those instructors are pretty good at seeing what you're doing. Here's the bottom line. It's pretty easy to fly, okay? Folks come to us through pilot training, flying something that does not have all the bells and whistles. I equate it to when I go to work, okay, and well, I work from home at this point, so this is, I can no longer use this analogy, but I used to use the analogy. When I go to work, I don't even think about getting in the car, putting up the garage door, backing out of the garage, driving, pulling into the parking spot, walking in the door. It's just, it's natural. It's just, it just happens. Sometimes I go, did I just drive to work? I don't even, or if I'm driving on a highway, I'm like, have I been awake for the last 3 hours? Because I don't even remember what I just did, right? It's just a natural thing. It almost becomes akin to breathing. Now, it's not quite that simple, but flying the F-35 is pretty darn close. It's like driving to work, right? Once you've, gotten a few hundred hours under your belt. Now, of course, there are some situations where really challenging weather, really challenging icy conditions or something like that. Of course, there are some times when you get the fear factor to go up a bit, but generally, the biggest problem with it is it's so easy to do from a just fly the plane perspective that complacency sets in and you're not paying as much attention because it's just pretty easy. It's like, man, I got auto throttles, I got speed control. The plane can almost land itself. It doesn't, you have to actually land it, but I can hold an angle of attack as I come into land. These are things I didn't have in the F-16. I can set my speed. Like the thing with the F-16 is like you didn't have a speed set, right? You couldn't do cruise control with speed. I could set but then if I put the throttle in the wrong place and left it there, the jet was so quiet because the canopy inflation, the system in the rails made it just like quiet. If I'm going 500 knots or I'm going 100 knots, it all sounds the same to me. And the fly-by-wire doesn't really give you a lot of feedback on that. So you're not getting like buffets like you do with a normal airplane because of fly-by-wire. And so we've lost a lot of folks prior to auto GCAS, which now pulls you up. Thank goodness we finally got that in there. I lost a lot of friends who just lost cross-check of their speed. Well, in the F-35, I can just set it and forget it. It's kind of like setting cruise control. So it's pretty easy. The problem is complacency because it is so easy. You'll get distracted by something else. And instead of set it and forget it, you actually just forgot it and never said it. And then you're in trouble. But it is easy to fly.
Does it have any vices then? I noticed the mishap report for the most recent loss came out recently. It was to do with on recovery. I think the pilot was too close to the airplane in front of him, hit some vortexes or something like that, and then something went wrong and the airplane flew out of control. And that sounds like quite an alarming thing for such an advanced airplane to do. You would think that hitting a vortex and would not result in a crash, but
I won't comment on that. I mean, all I'll say is aerodynamics are aerodynamics. Like there's only so much you can do with technology. If you hit something like a weather phenomenon or downdraft or, technology can go to a certain point, but there are weird things that happen too. And you can never engineer everything out of the environment. And that's why we need to live fly, right? Like you got to be prepared to handle the unexpected at some point, but I won't comment on any accidents or anything like that that's happened.
But did you have an unlimited flight envelope as far as you were concerned as a pilot? So you could tail slide it. There were you could do whatever you wanted to do with it. Well, obviously you hit the ground, but you could do whatever you wanted to do with the airplane aerodynamically.
Not quite. So through my career, it changed. The envelope kind of changed as tests got to see more things, and then as additional OFP updates were made and additional like maybe some flight control tweaks were made here and there. There are limitations to your flight envelope, and some of them are like some of them were kind of almost felt like a step backwards in the F-35, and it's just, you know, every aircraft has got certain, there are trade-offs. There are always trade-offs, and so there are some flight envelopes where I couldn't go. And like, really, I can't go there. I could go there all the time, but like in an F-16, they had something that was a AOA limiter. So what I couldn't do in the F-16 was really whip my nose around, and I couldn't do a whole lot of things with the rudder that were effective. Whereas with the F-35, I can do that really effectively. The problem is I won't have any energy after I do it, so it better work. But yeah, I could point the nose like really quickly to threaten by using a combination of rudders. Like in the F-16, I tell a student, put your feet flat on the floor, do not touch those rudders until it's time to land. Okay. Because you don't fly with rudders with a fly-by-wire F-16, but you do in the F-35, and it's a difference between like the two tails, and the aerodynamics are just different. But you've got to watch at certain AOAs. You got to limit a little bit what you can do. But in older aircraft, like there's no G limiter, so you pull back too hard, you over G the jet, right? In general, with the F-35, we can put the right controls in the right places where it's doing those things automatically. And there are limits, but you don't have to be the one to employ them. The flight control system, the flight control computers are employing them for you for the most part.
Is it possible to spike? I mean, I know that the F-16 you've got a 9G limit, but you can go beyond that because the flight control system may be lagging behind what's happening. Sure. Same for the F-35.
Yeah, but I think it's a little bit more rare. I think they've got the algorithms a little bit tighter on it.
We last question, then I think probably actually two more questions, but so penultimate question. Okay. We've talked about, we talked in our first call about the fact that it was a multi-service aircraft. In fact, it was a multi-nation aircraft. The JSF was designed from the beginning to be exportable. And so you've got lots of people asking for different things. You've already talked about how if the Air Force had not held its ground, it wouldn't have had a gun. As an operator, did you see things in the F-35 that were the result of, well, maybe you wouldn't have known, but did you see design decisions in the F-35 that you questioned, or did you see design decisions in the F-35 that you hadn't experienced as an F-16 guy? You thought, actually, this is cool. I haven't seen this before. What was your impression of that that whole compromise piece as an operator?
Yeah, reference my previous discussion on the free-thinking cowboy attitude. Every pilot you ever flown with has their opinions on how they should have done this better. And I saw a lot of it. There were a lot of things that I oftentimes would attribute to that weight discussion. Like, why in the heck did we not just put in a heads-up display that could pop up in case my helmet wasn't working right? And why did we go completely away from this? There were a lot of those sorts of things when you look at the position of things on the aircraft. If you think about the fact that the B model's got that giant fan right behind the seat, there's a lot of compromises that had to be made with that. There's compromises on, landing gear, and that's why those services each have things a little bit different, because the operating environments are a little bit different. But yeah, we saw them all the time. They're like the simple one that I referred to with the glass. Like, I hated that. Trying to put my radio in was a pain, and I hated that. And I was like, why don't you just give me this little tiny telephone pad where I can anchor my hand and just push buttons, and then I can just cue onto it here, and it can be out of the way where I'm not blocking my screens. Put it anywhere, man. Put it behind me if you need to. Let me push a button, man. And so yeah, I had lots of things like that were just my opinions. But then I talked to somebody, I was like, oh no, I love the glass. I just like so everybody's got their own opinions. You're never going to satisfy everyone. I do think they did a pretty good job. Now, the other big thing is, like, if you talk to the guys who came from Boeing products and the guys that came from the F-16, I had it easy. The F-16 had a thumb, for cueing most of your systems. It was all done through thumb movements. In the Eagle, it's done through your ring finger. And I'm like, man, I tried to get into an Eagle sim once, and I was like, man, I can't be refined with my movement. I'm like, opposable thumbs, man. We invented them. Take advantage. And they're like, oh no, that's stupid. Why would you do that? And so Generally, because it's a Lockheed product, it's pretty similar to an F-16, and so I liked that, personally. But sometimes I didn't like it because it was really close but different. So I'd find myself pushing the exact wrong button because it was so close to being right. Whereas the Eagle guy's like, man, I just had to like completely start over, and that in some ways was an advantage, and in some ways it was a disadvantage. So yeah, everybody's got opinions, and but I will tell you one thing for sure: my opinions are right.
It's so funny. So I know a guy, he's a former OT&E guy, F-15 guy. He went and did an exchange tour with the RAF flying the Typhoon, and he slammed the Typhoon for having a data entry panel of exactly the same kind that you're saying.
Oh,
Right.
really?
Yeah, he said the
That
Typhoon.
guy's wrong.
It's,
That
it's
guy
like
doesn't know what he's
he said it's
talking
like
about.
second or third generation cockpit design to put something that you have to actually thumb in order to do an alphanumeric keypad or whatever. So anyway, it's interesting. It tallies with what you said about everyone having different opinion, but yours is
Yeah.
right. So, okay, so final question then, Press, before we conclude. I just wondered if you had any enduring memories about flying the F-35A, whether or not, that was your first flight, your last flight, whether there was a moment of realization that this was the most sophisticated war machine that has ever been built and you're flying it. I mean, anything notable about flying the airplane?
Yeah, I mean, it's an emotional journey for anybody, but for my particular journey, the fact I was in the initial cadre, I mean, I was so excited. Like, I went to Eglin just all fired up. I was telling my parents, I'm going to get to be one of the first guys to fly this jet. It's just so excited. And so it was pretty soul crushing when it got delayed to the point that it became clear that for me to have the leadership opportunities that I also craved, I was not going to be able to stay in the jet. I needed to go back to the F-16 and take my command opportunity there. And so fast forward about 5 years from there, and I did some staff tours. I worked in the Pentagon. I went to school in Paris and did a exchange tour over there. I was having a great time. But then people would ask me, and after I did my Pentagon tour, I got sent to Korea to fly the F-16 again, and I was very happy to do it. I love the F-16. It's a great piece of machinery, fun to fly. But people would ask me in that in between time, it's like, dude, you were in the initial cadre, you never got to fly the jet. They're like, are you mad? Like, are you ever going to get to fly it? Because they picked you, like, you should get to fly it. And I was like, dude, there ain't a snowball's chance in hell they're ever going to let me fly the F-35. I was like, it's just not going to happen. Look at me, I'm old, man. I'm like, and I know like the military version of old is not everyone's version of old, but like, I'm in my 40s. They're not going to go teach me to fly a new plane at this point in my life. And sure enough, I was in Korea and I made the decision to go ahead and retire. And then it just didn't feel right. And so I said, no, and I had to make a decision really quickly. And I didn't even get to talk to my wife. And so I said, if I have to make a decision now, I choose to retire. And then I didn't sleep very well. Finally, it became daylight hours in the States. I called my spouse because we had kind of talked through it a little bit. But she's like, I don't know what to do. We need more time to think about it. But then she thought about it. And 2 days later, it just didn't feel right. And I was like, I'm not ready to be done. And then I got a call from the general in charge of 7th Air Force. And he was calling to say, hey, are you sure you want to retire? Because, there are other bigger things for you, et cetera. And we had just come to the decision that that's not what we want to do. I said, sir, stop right there. In the moment, that's what I thought I needed to do. It doesn't feel right. I want back in the game. And then the next week, the available wing commands came out, and the F-35 wing at Eglin was one of them. I was like, what if I went back there? And so I was like, they'll never pick me because I never got to actually fly the jet. But it turned out nobody who was old like me had flown the jet because the other guys in the initial cadre had either gone back because they got delayed or they were too young to be a wing commander, and nobody had F-35 experience. I was like, well, at least I sat around and prepared for the jet for 18 months, so I'll throw my hat in the ring. And sure enough, I got picked to be the wing commander of the F-35 wing. So it was the first flight, coming back, what is that, like 10 years after I'd been selected, and then I actually get to raise that gear handle. That was emotional.
That's very cool. Wow. Thank you so much, Press, for joining us and giving us the benefit of your expertise and your insight, and for telling us about the F-35A. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, I enjoyed the talk and look forward to talking to you more about other stuff.
Thanks, Press.
All right, see ya.
I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did, but there's still more to come. We'll be back soon with Steve and discussions on both the developmental and operational test and evaluation of the F-35, so stay tuned to Authentic. We at Authentic appreciate your subscribing to our channel. If you'd like to help us bring more content and grow the channel, leave a rating and a review on your listening platform of choice and tell a friend. Thanks for listening.